The tragedy of Cueva Los Angeles Cave. On May 30th, 1999, an unforgettable event took place. Frank was an experienced caver. He knew every rock and protrusion in the cave by heart. That is why he was authorized to guide others. He was going to take a group of 17 people into the cave and show them all its beauty and unique nature. The group included both experienced and inexperienced individuals. Among them was a woman named Elba. Elba was going into a cave for the first time in her life. Caves fascinated her, but she was also very afraid. That's why she was going to face her fears and enter the cave today. Frank agreed to let her enter the cave because of her desire. The team finished all their preparations in front of the cave at 12 o'clock. With Frank in the lead, the whole team entered the cave. The first step would never be forgotten by this team. When they entered, it was dark and damp. They easily made their way through the first parts of the cave. Now they had to pass through an area with a stream on the ground, which was relatively more challenging. This area was very easy for Frank. However, it would be a new experience for the inexperienced cavers in the team. Perhaps they shouldn't have had this experience. As they were moving forward, Frank suddenly stopped. Something was wrong. His experience told him that there was danger ahead. During the winter, heavy rains can seep into the ground from far away and cause sudden flash floods in caves. And inside the cave, the flood waters move forward in waves. Frank knew this, so they had to act immediately. Otherwise, they would be swept away by the powerful water current in the dark cave. As he predicted, the water level began to rise. The water, which had been flowing calmly just a moment ago, suddenly began to rage. Frank immediately directed the team to the slope on the side. This slope was the only way for the team to escape. The slope led to a safer road above. Everyone started climbing. Fears, screams, and the sound of water all mixed together. At that very moment, Elba, the inexperienced member of the group, was in shock from all that was happening. She was trying to climb the slope, not very confident in herself. And then the feared moment happened. Elba's foot slipped, and she fell into the water. She disappeared into the dark waters amid screams. The current was dragging Elba along, bumping her left and right. Frank, who witnessed the incident, jumped into the water without a moment's hesitation, like a true hero. He pushed forward without giving up in the rough water. After a tough struggle, he caught up with Elba. He held her tightly and grabbed onto a rock himself to prevent himself from being swept away. However, the hardest part was just beginning. A difficult struggle against the current would test Frank. They began to advance inch by inch. Despite the powerful current and the cold water, they managed to reach the slope. The other team members, seeing Elba and Frank, encouraged Frank with their inspiring words. Despite being exhausted, Frank pushed Elba upward with one last effort. The other team members above held Elba and pulled her up. Everyone let out a deep sigh of relief for a moment, but this joy was short-lived for them. Frank was trying to climb upward. However, he was very tired and had run out of strength. He managed to grab onto a rock with one last effort. Just as he was making one final push upward, a new wave hit Frank and knocked him into the water. The team members could do nothing but watch. Frank disappeared into the cold, turbulent waves and was swept into the depths of the cave. A backup guide team directed them to a drier and safer area. The team waited in this safe area, deeply saddened. Elba fell into a psychological breakdown. Frank had sacrificed himself for Elba. This first cave adventure witnessed a scene he never expected. The team waited in this safe area for 10 hours without leaving the cave due to the flood. The rescue team outside sounded the alarm and entered the cave. The rescue team first found the trapped team and brought them out. Frank's lifeless body was recovered on the same day. Little River Springs disaster. Date, November 26th, 2003. Little River Spring in Florida, where the disaster began. Jerry, 42, and Kane, 46, were two friends who were experts in cave diving. That day, they had a routine plan. They would explore the cave with their underwater scooters and then return before their air tanks ran out. According to the 1/3 rule used in diving, the air in their tanks was sufficient for approximately 80 minutes of exploration, and they needed to return to the surface before that time elapsed. The pair arrived at the site early in the morning. After completing their preparations, they began their dive. At first, everything was wonderful. The sun's rays illuminated the cave's crystal clear waters like a giant flashlight, and the atmosphere was peaceful. A guide rope left by previous divers was also in place. This rope is of vital importance in cave diving, since it is almost impossible to find your way underwater. Divers can follow this rope to avoid getting lost. As they moved deeper into the cave, the light dimmed. The environment grew increasingly quiet, and darkness enveloped them in tunnel-like passages. The powerful flashlights they carried could only illuminate a few meters ahead. Such underwater caves are extremely dangerous, even for the most experienced divers. When the cave walls are touched, sediment dislodged from the surface clouds the water and reduces visibility to zero. This is a deadly risk. The slightest mistake could cost them their lives. The pair reached a narrow area that deepened vertically, known as the well cover. This point was like a line of destiny. Jerry suddenly stopped. He was hesitant to move forward. Kane gestured with his hands, signaling, "Let's continue." Jerry nodded in agreement and moved forward. However, as Jerry passed through the passage, his foot touched the cave wall. This minor contact was the moment that triggered the disaster. After moving a few meters forward, Kane looked back and noticed that Jerry was not following. He immediately turned back. The scene he saw was terrifying. Everything was blurry and dark. Jerry was nowhere to be seen. Kane panicked, feeling around and reaching out randomly. At that moment, His hand touched Jerry, and he immediately grabbed him tightly. He felt a brief moment of joy, but the danger was not over yet. Kane was struggling to control the underwater scooter with one hand, so he decided to attach the scooter to the guide rope. This was a standard safety measure to prevent getting lost. However, after securing the scooter, when he reached out to Jerry again, he couldn't feel him. The real disaster had now begun. The water had become much murkier than before. Kane waved his hand from side to side, trying to find his friend. There was no light, no movement, no sound. Kane tried to attract Jerry's attention by banging on the oxygen tank to make noise, but that didn't work either. Despite trying for minutes, he couldn't reach Jerry. Meanwhile, his own air supply was rapidly running out. He had to head for the exit to survive. Kane carefully but quickly moved toward the surface, holding onto the guide rope. Meanwhile, Jerry had completely lost his bearings in the dark, muddy water. He had no guide rope and was helplessly drifting from side to side, hoping to find a familiar area. When Kane reached the surface, he immediately called for help. Two divers in the area quickly entered the water and began the rescue operation. When they reached the depths, they found Jerry. Unfortunately, Jerry had already drowned because his air tank had run out. The Caribbean Cave Disaster. Date: July 13th, 1991. The Caribbean. David and Alex were two close friends. The two young men were enjoying their vacation on the Caribbean coast. While walking on the beach, a beautiful girl approached them. She told them that there was a cave in the area and that there was a secret pool inside. The two excited and curious young men immediately set off for the cave, hoping to impress the girl. This was the mistake of their lives. They arrived at the cave entrance. David and Alex had no previous experience with caves or diving. However, hoping to cool off from the hot weather, they entered the cave. They were even more excited when the air cooled down at the entrance. However, just beyond the entrance, the cave tunnel sloped downwards at a 25-meter angle. The cave surface was wet, damp, and slippery. David hesitated for a moment. He was nervous. Alex convinced his friend, and they began their descent. The two friends slowly made their way down, holding onto the slippery ground. Even though their hands slipped from time to time, they continued to move forward. When they reached the bottom, a pool of water greeted them. They thought this couldn't be the secret pool they had mentioned, as the initial entrance was quite narrow. Alex wanted to continue. This request was risky for both friends. They put on their snorkels and jumped into the cold water. They swam through the dark and narrow cave tunnels. When they ran out of breath, they took a breath from the air pockets and continued on. After swimming for about 30 minutes, they reached a large area. This was probably the secret pool that the beautiful girl had mentioned. Alex and David rested for a while in this area where they could relax. Alex wanted to keep going a bit further to see new places, but David didn't want to. He said they should go back. This time, Alex agreed with his friend. They jumped back into the water to return. During their return, Alex's foot hit the cave surface. This is the most dangerous situation for these two friends. When his foot hit the cave surface, dirt spread across the cave floor, and now everything was dark. David continued straight ahead without changing direction. Alex, however, panicked for a moment and changed his route. He could no longer see his friend. He continued relentlessly without looking ahead. He veered off the path and continued through a different tunnel. He hurried forward, trying to reach a small air pocket. Moving quickly out of excitement and fear, he hit his head on a small rock. The air pocket was very small. After taking a deep breath, he had to dive back into the water. He tried to move forward, despite the pain in his head and his shortness of breath. Every second was crucial for Alex. His breath was starting to run out. Suddenly, he found himself in an air pocket. This air pocket was relatively larger. This place was of vital importance to Alex. David managed to find the exit by chance. He quickly got out of the water. When he looked around, he couldn't see Alex. His heart began to race. He couldn't decide what to do. Should he go outside and ask for help? He wasn't sure. He thought of the flashlight. He started shining the flashlight into the water. Maybe Alex could see the light and get out. Alex took one last deep breath and dove back into the water. His only hope was to get out of there and walk along the shore. He had no intention of ever embarking on such a dangerous adventure again. He began to see a light in the distance. Was he dying? He continued toward the light. Suddenly, he saw David in front of him. Taking a deep breath, he hugged David. The two, overcome with emotion, wanted to get out as soon as possible. They immediately began climbing. Despite the difficulty, they managed to make it out. When they emerged from the cave, the girl on the beach was there too. The girl had become anxious when she saw David and Alex enter the cave and had waited there. David and Alex mentioned how beautiful the secret pool was, and then moved on. The disappearing river cave was discovered on September 12, 1987. However, unfavorable events during the exploration changed the fate of the cave a bit. Marco, James, and Ed, three experienced vertical cavers, were preparing to enter Vanishing River Cave. They had basic knowledge about the cave. It was 51 meters deep. It had a vertical passage, and most importantly, it was slippery. With this in mind, the team packed all the necessary equipment. The entrance to the cave was quite dangerous, so the area was cordoned off as there was a good chance that a hiker could fall in. The weather was overcast that day, and it looked like it was going to rain, but the team ignored this detail. But this detail was very important to someone. James, the leader of the team, took a 135-meter rope from his pocket and lowered it into the cave. He then began to slowly abseil down the rope and shared what he saw with his teammates. The cave had 2 levels. When James reached the first level, there was no problem. His teammates followed James in turn. The first ledge they descended was about 28 meters long, and they held onto the rope again for the remaining 23 meters. Now they were at the bottom of the cave, and it was as if they were in a big room. Ed immediately took out his notebook and wrote down his observations. A little further down, where we first descended, the cave narrows and becomes a small hole. After writing this down, they had to get out because they were about 51 meters underground, and it was very difficult to breathe. Marco started climbing on the rope first. Marco was a very good climber and knew techniques that nobody else knew. When Marco reached the first ledge, James and Ed started to climb up as well. But at that moment, they heard a loud noise and realized that they had made a big mistake. They had to leave the cave immediately because the sound they heard was a clap of thunder. The weather detail they had overlooked when entering the cave was now going to get them into big trouble. Cave. The rain caused stones to fall on him, and one of these stones hit Marco on the head. The force of the impact meant that Marco's hands could no longer hold on to the ropes. His body fell downwards and hit the steep slopes of the cave. James and Ed heard a loud noise and quickly climbed up the rope. They were stunned by what they saw. Marco had fallen heavily onto the stone floor. He could no longer move, and his breath was slowly coming out of him. They had to call for help immediately, but the stones kept falling, and there was nothing they could do. They had to wait. It was getting darker and darker. James and Ed had to do something. They were devastated when they realized that their beloved teammate Marco was no longer breathing. It was all over for James and Ed. If they did nothing, they too could die. They began to climb the rope, holding the board they had taken out of the bag over their heads. But Ed was in great danger. The board slipped out of his hand. Ed was in a very difficult situation. He quickly got under James, and with his help, tried to protect himself from the stones. Eventually, they both quickly reached the top and were rescued. But their teammate Marco had lost his life. James and Ed never expected a cave exploration to end so badly. The rain had stopped, and they had to call for help. The rescue team that arrived after a while was very upset to see James and Ed in this state. They immediately set about rescuing Marco and called for a helicopter. The helicopter threw a strong rope and landed the medical team safely next to Marco. They tied Marco to the rope, and the helicopter slowly lifted him into the air. That's how Marco was taken out of the cave that had become his grave. But Marco had already lost his life. It was with great sadness that he said goodbye to his last journey. An old mining accident. On September 25th, 1998, a mining accident occurred during the exploration of a mine cave. The exploration team was very excited, as this would be the first exploration for some of them. However, for others, the exploration of the mine would turn into a nightmare. 3 new researchers came across a mine cave while walking in the forest. This mine cave had been closed because it was no longer in use. The 3 friends decided to enter the mine. This mine was the Dek mine in Cambodia. It had been opened by a Chinese company to search for gold. However, it had been closed again due to the local community's reaction. The cave was unfinished, posing a high risk of collapse and featuring narrow passages. However, these risks seemed very exciting to Tim. 3 friends went deeper into the cave. Every step they took was dangerous for them. As they continued, they noticed that the air was getting thinner and the humidity was increasing. However, they did not think about turning back. Through narrow passages, they finally reached a room with a low ceiling. "We should go back now," Mike warned his friends. But Tim saw another narrow tunnel and wanted to go in. His friends told him how dangerous it was to go in there, but Tim was very curious. The passage was really small. It was only 40 centimeters wide and narrowed towards the bottom. Tim had made up his mind. His goal was to get in there and see what was inside. But if he decided to go back in, it was certain that he would not come out again. At first, there were no problems. Only the rocks were a little slippery because of the moisture. For Tim, who was slowly making his way, a nightmare was unfolding. It was Tim's first time in a tunnel, and he had no experience. Since he didn't have a rope with him, he held onto the rocks with his hands. The rocks were very slippery and had sharp edges. After about 3.5 meters, Tim stepped on a rock that was not stable. He slipped and began to fall, hitting the walls of the cave. The place where he fell was very narrow, and he couldn't move at all. Tim called out to his friends in a low voice and then began to lose consciousness. His friends noticed that Tim had fallen, but they couldn't see see anything. David rushed to the exit and called for help. While Mike was thinking about how to rescue Tim, the rescue team arrived at the cave entrance and entered with tools in hand. As David and the rescue team made their way to their friend, they realized how deep the cave was. Meanwhile, Tim's condition continued to deteriorate. He waited helplessly in the narrow space. The rescue team finally reached Mike. One member of the team began to widen the tunnel with a hammer. After making some progress, the rescuer's hand slipped from his grip and began to fall. No one expected him to make such a simple mistake, but it happened. He hit the rock and fell directly on Tim. The force of the fall caused Tim to fall even deeper and get stuck again. Tim was now completely unconscious. The rescuer began to suffocate because he was also trapped. Now, there were not just one person trapped in the cave, but two. The cave was so narrow that it was impossible to see anything. Time was running out. The rescue team had to act immediately. The team immediately hung up a rope and managed to widen the cave with a drill. As they descended a little further, they saw the officer, who was a teammate, and pulled him up. Then they went deeper into the cave and found Tim. Although it was a little more difficult to rescue Tim, they finally managed to reach him. They pulled him up immediately. Tim was in very bad condition, but he was still alive. After the rescue team pulled the two injured men out, they quickly left the cave and took them to the hospital. Tim and Leif, one of the rescuers, survived the treatment and both made a full recovery. The Nightmare of Devil's Den Cave. On October 10th, 2000, Daniel, a 22-year-old instructor, set off with 5 of his students for Devil's Den Cave in Florida. This cave was a very eerie and mysterious place. There were some important details that Daniel had overlooked in this project. Above all, he had forgotten about his health problems and gained a lot of weight. When Daniel and his students arrived at the entrance to the cave, it looked really scary. Although the students were a little afraid, they were quite excited. Once inside, they began to move through a long tunnel, bending down one after the other. Of course, Daniel, who was a little overweight, had difficulty moving through the tunnel. The group's goal was to gather information and experience for an exploration competition organized at the school. After traveling for a while, they came across another passageway. This passageway connected the two tunnels. Daniel, the leader of the group, wanted to climb down after examining the pit with his flashlight. However, he realized that this would be difficult due to his weight. He still wanted to climb down and ask the children to take notes, but no one expected this to turn into a nightmare. Daniel's plan was simple. First, he would get the children through the hole, then he would follow. The children passed through the hole one by one and descended into the lower tunnel. Now it was Daniel's turn. Daniel took his first step by sucking in his stomach, then lowered his entire body down. However, due to his weight, he got stuck in the hole. He couldn't go down or come up. Worse still, the students couldn't help Daniel. The students were in the lower tunnel, while Daniel was stuck in the passageway. The other group leader waited outside the cave to see when the project would end. They must be having a lot of fun in there, he thought to himself, but he didn't know what was going on inside. Daniel and his students continued to wait helplessly in the cave. The students were scared, and their screams echoed off the cave walls. The group leader, who was outside, became suspicious when he heard a humming noise coming from inside and immediately called the police. The police arrived at the scene with a search and rescue team. When they found Daniel in the cave, they immediately began rescue operations. The first idea was to pull Daniel up, but that was unsuccessful. Then they came up with the idea of carefully widening the passageway. The rescue team told the boys waiting below to step back a little, as rocks could fall on their heads from above. Using a drill and hammer, the team began to widen the passageway where Daniel was trapped, bit by bit. After widening it a little, Daniel climbed through the gap and was immediately pulled up. Daniel was very afraid, not for himself, but for the children. Then the rescue team pulled the children up one by one. The children were very frightened and wanted to get out of the cave as quickly as possible. Everyone moved at full speed towards the cave exit. One of the students got his foot stuck in a hole and started screaming in pain. The other students were even more frightened, and the team immediately pulled him out. The team leader, who was waiting outside, was very happy to see the children. However, when he couldn't see one of them, he became very concerned. The guide said that the student was inside and had gotten his foot stuck, but that there was no need to worry. The rescue team that remained inside the cave carefully freed the student's foot from its anchorage and made their way to the cave entrance. Eventually, everyone managed to leave the cave. The ambulance waiting outside took the children and the guide to a hospital. After a period of treatment, the entire team recovered physically. The Black Cave Disaster. Thomas Edward was lying at home in April 1995. He had an idea and told his wife about it. He wanted to go to the Black Cave in Arizona. He was very hopeful because he had explored this cave before. He took only a miner's lamp and entered the cave. He fearlessly walked along the same path he had traveled before. Suddenly, he noticed another passage. Should I enter here? He asked himself. Perhaps hoping to make the discovery of the century, he entered that passage. This passage he had just begun was getting narrower and narrower, but Thomas Edward kept moving forward without hesitation. Perhaps in his heroic sense of being an explorer, he was not thinking rationally. As time passed, the humidity in the cave increased and movement became difficult. He realized he could go no further and decided to turn back, but the humidity and darkness confused his mind. He lost his sense of time. He kept moving left and right, but could not find the exit. At that moment, his lamp flickered and went out. Everything became more difficult. He was left in the middle of the darkness. He was able to provide light for a while with matches hidden in his shoe, but it was so humid, the matches quickly ran out. Now he was left with only total darkness. With a clever plan, he left the unnecessary items with him as road signs, in order not to return to the same paths again. After a while, tired, hungry, and thirsty, he reached an area called Fissure. It was a narrow crevice, only 10 centimeters wide. He tried to enter with his feet, hoping that maybe this was the exit. His feet went in, but his buttocks got stuck. He tried to move to get out, but without success. He was trapped inside the narrow crevice. It seemed impossible to get out of here. The only thing he could think of was to scream. Maybe a miracle would happen and someone would find him. For days he waited in the cave, without food or water. He was completely drained of energy. Who knows what he thought those days in the deep darkness. Thomas's wife was very worried. She immediately called the police and explained the situation. The police launched a search with special teams. But there was a problem. Thomas hadn't told anyone which cave he was going to. This put the police in a difficult situation and wasted time. After meticulous police work, the cave where Thomas's car was found was identified. Preparations were immediately made and they entered the cave. As they went in, they found some of Thomas's belongings, such as his shirt and glasses. This was good news, but the police had failed to notice the secret passage. Incredibly, Thomas was still alive. After days of fruitless searching, the team withdrew from the cave. His wife didn't give up. She called for a new search and rescue operation. Missing persons notices were placed all over the city, but to no avail. Hope was lost. Thomas's remains were found in December 1996, 1.5 years after the incident, by 3 people exploring the cave. Incident at Megawell Cave. January 13th, 1991 was an ordinary Sunday. A 3-man cave exploration team decided to go to Megawell Cave in Alabama. The leader of the team was John. John was a seasoned caver with 10 years of experience and was very confident. The other 2 people accompanying him were Linda and Charles. Although Linda and Charles were not very experienced cavers, they wanted to enter this cave and they trusted John. Their plan was to enter the cave, explore it by descending 310 meters down a large waterfall and then return. After the preparations were completed, the team arrived in front of the cave. The rope in John's hand looked a little old. Linda asked him why. John said that he had bought the rope from a Polish caver and had heard that it could hold 2 tons of weight. However, due to the recent heavy rains, the water level in the river flowing into the cave had risen considerably. Despite this, John said they could go ahead, trusting in his experience. So the team entered the cave. They decided to descend from the right side of the waterfall and started to prepare. The waterfall was so high that there was a strong roar coming from below. John went down first, using the rope they had brought. The waterfall was completely wet, and the descent was quite difficult. Once down, John checked the rope. Then Linda carefully climbed down the rope. It was Charles's turn. Charles was a bit worried because he weighed 119 kilos with his equipment. He started down very carefully and checked the rope. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he made it down the waterfall. The team had difficulty hearing each other because of the roar of the falls, but this did not stop the expedition. They started to pass through narrow passages. They were running out of energy as time went on, but they pushed on for 45 minutes. Linda was starting to feel cold and asked to turn back. The team agreed and headed for the exit. Actually, they were all cold in this environment. Time seemed to pass very fast inside the cave. When they reached the waterfall, John and Linda climbed up the rope. John took Linda to the car and told her to warm up. Then he went back to the cave to get Charles, but Charles still hadn't come up. John tried to make his voice heard, but he thought it didn't reach down because of the noise of the waterfall. He waited in fear. 20 minutes passed and John began to panic. When he pulled up the rope, the end was cut off and empty. John examined the situation with astonishment. He hurried out of the cave and ran to Linda. He told her the situation. Linda was in shock. They didn't have their cell phones with them, so they got into the car to call for help. They stopped the first car on the road and asked for help. Then they hurried to a caving equipment shop and bought a sturdy new rope. They returned to the cave. John left Linda at the cave entrance. Linda was to meet the arriving rescue team. John took the rope and went inside. He looked down into the dark cave. He hoped that maybe by some miracle he could see his friend. friend. When he couldn't see anything in the dark, he quickly lowered the rope he had just bought and started to descend. His heart was beating fast. He tried not to think negatively, but psychologically he was not well. As she went down, she began to see Charles, but Charles was motionless. She went to him and checked his pulse. It was horrible. There was no pulse. All her fears had come true. He looked at his friend for a long time, blaming himself. But these accusations didn't change anything. Desperate, he climbed up again. When he came up, the rescue team had just arrived at the cave. John told them about the situation. The team started work immediately. They worked in the cave all night long. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Charles's lifeless body was pulled out of the cave. The investigation revealed that the rope John had bought from the Polish caver was not strong. At the end of the investigation, that caver was arrested. Cruise Cave disaster. On the morning of May 15th, 1982, 3 friends set out to explore Cruise Cave in California. The team consisted of Alex, Mark, and Ethan. All 3 were experienced cavers. But Cruise Cave was unlike any place they had ever been before. When they reached the cave, they prepared all their equipment and went in. As soon as they stepped into the cave, Alex felt a fear he couldn't describe. He didn't know why, but he didn't tell his friends about this uneasiness. He didn't want to worry them. Inwardly fearful, he began to move forward. As the team went deeper into the cave, they had to pass through narrow passages. They came across a section known as the torture chamber, the most difficult part of the cave. This was the narrowest and scariest part of the cave. Due to the structure of the cave, going down was easy, but going up was a great risk. They decided to move forward by taking this risk. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. They felt as if they were suffocating with every step. Finally, they crossed the narrow passage and reached a small room. They were very tired and hungry. In this small room, they rested for a while and filled their bellies with the canned food they had brought with them. They wanted to recharge their batteries. During dinner, Alex finally told the team about his restlessness. At first, Mark and Ethan laughed it off. Alex didn't say anything more in the face of this reaction. Even though he was scared inside, he couldn't leave his friends there and go back. The team was about to set off again when suddenly there was a buzzing sound coming from deep underground. It was as if a creature roared beneath the ground. Immediately, there was a violent tremor. It was a 6.1 magnitude earthquake. Rocks were falling on them from all sides as they tried to stay on their feet. It was a real nightmare. But when the tremor ended, all 3 of them were alive. They were just covered in dust and rocks. The fear in Alex's eyes deepened. They decided to turn back without wasting time because every second counted now. The walls of the cave were loose and could collapse at any moment. After they had traveled for about 5 minutes, there was another earthquake. This time, the magnitude was 5.9. Again, they faced their fears. Fortunately, no one was hurt again, but Alex's fear grew even greater. "Don't leave me here," he shouted in panic. Mark tried to calm him down. "Okay, we won't." Finally, they came to the place they feared the most, the torture room. It was so narrow that it was almost impossible to breathe. They just wanted to avoid a concussion on the way out. Mark and Ethan were leading the way, and Alex was right behind them. Just as they were making their way through the passage, the ominous sound was heard once more. Immediately afterwards, another earthquake struck, this time with a magnitude of 5.7. Screams of fear and panic mingled with the sound of falling stones. Everyone was trying to hold on to something. The earthquake lasted a long time. Meanwhile, the boulder Alex was holding onto broke loose. He lost his balance and fell straight into the torture chamber. When silence fell, Alex's voice was heard. "Help! I'm stuck." There was so much dust that it was almost impossible to breathe. Mark and Ethan quickly tried to free Alex. They dangled a rope to him and tried to pull the rocks away, but to no avail. Alex's voice was getting weaker. "I'm sorry, you have to go," he said with sadness in his eyes. Mark and Ethan tried for hours, but to no avail. At the end of 6 hours, in desperation, they had to leave Alex there and left the cave to call for help. After a great effort, they managed to get out of the cave and immediately called for help. After about 10 hours, the search and rescue team pulled Alex's lifeless body out of the cave. Stickman, be happy if you subscribe and like the channel.